Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Erin Quinn Belcho, and I am the museum curator for the Lacey Museum. Tonight is the first in our season's history talks, and we will be hearing from author and historian Drew Crooks about his research into early artist Edward Lange. Before we dive right in, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. My slide will move forward. There we go. The Lacey Museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically Southern Lushootseed speakers, the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes. We acknowledge and remember not to forget those tribal people that are named but not recognized today and absorbed into other tribes for survival or were relocated. We recognize the ancestors and their relations that are still here. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as a part of the city of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in government-to-government partnership. All right, so we'd love to see you at the museum. We are open Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and Saturdays, 10 to 4. Right now, we've got a temporary exhibit up through October called 1968, the year that rocked Washington. And it was brought to us from Legacy, Washington in the Secretary of State's office. This exhibit looks back at 1968 and its impact on Washington state through the stories of some remarkable people who lived through it. It's on display at the museum and at Lacey City Hall. And probably the biggest comment we've been getting from people is what correlation there is between the events in the late 60s and those today. There's a case with letters from the communities in Washington to Governor Evans, and they're funny and poignant and just really show you in some ways how things haven't changed. Coming later this fall, we will be hosting a Smithsonian poster exhibit called Journey Stories. It explores how movement has shaped our nation with a look at American expansion and migration from the earliest settlers and Native American displacement to the effects of transportation on modern mobility. And we're going to add some pieces to our tour that includes local ties to this same story. So we hope you'll come and check it out. And then coming up in just 2 weeks is our October history talk with Karen Johnson of the Schmidt House. It's called Scoundrels, The Life of Susie Lewis. Over a century ago, Tumwater resident Susie Lewis suffered a chain of tragedies: abuse, broken homes, infidelity, murder, abandonment, divorce, a child's death, a fatal disease, and her misfortunes continued even after she died. So Karen Johnson will present us an illustrated true crime talk about Susie's life and loves, including the scoundrels who hounded her to an early grave. All right, let's move on to tonight's presentation. As a reminder, we will hold our question and answer section until the end of Drew's presentation, but as you are going along, if you have any questions, you can please feel free to put them in the Q&A button. Usually that's located on the bottom of your screen, but just go ahead and put your comments or questions in when you have them, and we will read them out at the end of the presentation. Now I would like to introduce Drew. I'm going to stop sharing.
You can talk about it.
Oh, okay.
Drew Crooks received a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology and a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Washington. For over 35 years, he has worked with various museums in the South Puget Sound, including a stint right here with the Lacey Museum. He has written numerous articles and 5 books on the region's heritage and presented history talks to many school classes and community groups. And we are so delighted to have him with us tonight. And I'll hand it over to you, Drew.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, now remember that button forward
Mhm.
and that button backward.
Okay.
That button.
Okay.
And press
Yeah,
it. Just press it once.
Thank you.
Okay.
My daughter was helping me. I am pleased to be here today and honored to be part of the History Talks series by the Lacey Museum. History can be studied many different ways. And one way I particularly like, and other people have done this too, is to combine history and art. And there's no greater example than Edward Lange, who was an early artist in Thurston County and elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Why Edward Lange? Back in the 1980s and 90s, I was a curator at the Washington State Capitol Museum in Olympia. And I started noticing artwork done by a person called Edward Lange. I was impressed by it. I thought, who did this? Who was he? And when I looked into it, there was hardly any information. In fact, most of the time he was called William Lange by mistake, not Edward Lange. And then I started investigating and found that he was active over in Long Island, New York. And over there, he's like famous. He was active there in the 1870s and 1880s. And he's still very famous there. In fact, right now, at this moment, the Preservation Long Island organization based in Cold Harbor Springs, Long Island, they're doing a massive campaign to do a database of all known Edward Lange images of Long Island. There's a major exhibit that opened last week of all the known Edward Lange paintings and artwork they can get that will be at the Long Island Museum and will run through December. And then next year, they hope to publish a major book on Edward Lange in Long Island. But here in Washington, he wasn't known. And so I started doing research on him, and I did a first wave publication back in 2004 when I put together some preliminary conclusions in 2 articles I wrote, one for the Pacific Northwest Quarterly and one for the Olympia Geological Society bulletin. Then in 2012, I published a book on Edward Lange that's available at different local libraries. It's out of print now. And since 2012, I've been doing a lot of research on him, continue to do it, and have found a lot of new images and information about him. And my presentation today will focus on the Lacey area and Thurston County, and also will focus on some of the recent discoveries I made. But I will touch on Long Island. I will touch on elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest, just a little bit. Edward Lange was a German American. He was born in Germany on February 4th, 1846, in Darmstadt, Germany, in what at that time was known as the Grand Duchy of Hesse. And at that time, Germany, of course, was not unified. That came in 1871 under Prussia, became a unified country. There was different states, and this was a state of Hesse. Interestingly, also born in 1846 in Hesse was Leopold Schmidt, the founder of the Olympia Brewing Company. Lange was born, his father was Gustav Georg Lange. His mother was Sophia Illing Lange. And in recent years, in fact, just the last couple of years, my daughter has done, Jennifer Crooks, a historian too, she has done a lot of research on the Lange family. And one thing that's interesting is that Lange did not come from an ordinary family. He came from a family that was quite distinguished in different fields. Some were ministers, some were soldiers, and never were artists. His father, in fact, Gustav, was a major engraver, publisher, and bookseller. And this is from the British Museum. It's a German community on the Rhine as depicted in the early 19th century. It's from a book by Gustav Georg Lange. And what's interesting is that Ludwig Lange, a brother of Gustav, did the picture. And it's how can I say it? Gustav, two of his brothers are particularly notable. Ludwig Lange was an architect and also an artist, professional artist. And Julian Lange was an artist too. Now, it appears that one time, and I should mention that Edward Lange came from a very large family. I was surprised. He's one of 12 children. When he did come to the United States, other brothers came too. Mid-19th century Germany was in upheaval politically, economically, socially, and a lot of Germans immigrated. One brother, another Gustav, was involved in his father's printing business in New York City. One became a music teacher in Port Jefferson, Long Island, New York. And one I was really curious to find came out to St. Louis and then came out, and he was head of German Singing Society. He came out to Port Angeles, Washington, and became a music teacher, owned a music store. But in any case, Edward Lange probably came several times between Europe and the United States. But in 1870, he came to settle here permanently. And he came to Long Island, New York. Now, on this map, if you look to the left, that's New York City. And to the right, in the time of Edward Lange, in the 1870s, 1880s, it's a very rural area, lots of farms, small towns. Edward Lange settled up on the north of the island, right in the middle. And just south of that is the town of Huntington. And then down on the south coast is Babylon. So in a sense, he lived between Huntington and Babylon. And the place where he lived was out in the countryside. It was called many names, Comic, Dix Hills, but the main name was Elwood. And for the next, well, he started as a farmer, but we believe now, recent thought on this, is that he came to be an artist. And so from the beginning, whether he was trained in Europe a little bit, self-taught, we don't know. But in 1870, 71, he started drawing the farms, the businesses, and the communities around him, going from on the left side, Queens, now part of New York City, all the way out to Sag Harbor on the east coast of Long Island. This is a picture of Edward around 1880. I should mention, he got married on Long Island to Sarah Denton, and they had 6 children. One sadly died when she was a child. The other 5 lived to adulthood. Now in Long Island, he did types of art, but mainly he did a lot of homes and farms. And this is the Burr Homestead on Long Island. It's a watercolor and gouache on paper, about 1880. And you'll see examples in the Lacey area that look very close to this, but they're different farms. This is one of my favorite Long Island pictures. It's kind of a pride and joy on Long Island by the museums. And this is the Lower Main Street in Northport, Long Island in 1880. And one of the things curious about Lange is that he was so detailed. And his details are usually very accurate. If you look in the street, you see a strange small structure. It looks almost like, I don't know what you would think it is, but basically it's a tree and it's protected on all sides. It's right in the center of the street, probably to the right of the street. and it has a lamp on it. So I suppose at nighttime you wouldn't run your buggy into it. Now, in 1889, after a pretty impressive career in Long Island, Edward Lange and his family came to Washington State, brand new Washington State. Had just become a state in 1889, November 11th, and he was supposed to arrive, according to family tradition, on December 7th. And he came to Olympia, the state capital. Now, this is an early photograph of Lange in Olympia, about 1893. And I find it an extremely interesting picture. If you look on the background, I think most likely Lange painted that scenic background. And it sure looks like the Tumwater to me, the kind of imaginative picture of it, but the bridge across and one of the waterfalls. And in his hands, he's holding one of his drawings, which often were a combination of different drawings into a montage, a group of drawings with one big panoramic one in the middle. And I took a look at with a magnifying glass, and it's one that has not survived. One of the saddest things is many pictures of Edward Lange that we know about from newspapers and other accounts have not survived. Now, Lange was very active in the Lacey area. And at that time, of course, there was no Lacey. It was not even, it was a community, but really, probably most accurately, a series of farms. And this is one of his most famous pictures at the Washington State Historical Society, and it's the David and Elizabeth Chambers Farm. And it's from about the 1890s. And what I find fascinating is that this farm is now the site of Panorama City. After it was a farm, it became the Mountain View Golf Course, and the farmhouse became the clubhouse. And then when Panorama City came to place, that is kind of the heart of Panorama City. When he describes a farm, when he portrays a farm, paints a farm, he did it in different techniques. He did sometimes just pencil, sometimes in watercolor and gouache, sometimes oil painting. And in this one, you see all the details of farming life. And one I always find interesting, a lot of the farms had windmills to pump water. And you can see one right by the farmhouse there. It seems to me that Lange liked animals. There's a lot of horse and sheep and other animals in these pictures. Now, this is a detail of the Lange, and it's a fascinating picture. And of course, he's presenting the farm as best as possible. I imagine that the Chambers family purchased this drawing, this watercolor, and they hung it up with pride in the house. And it's one of the most famous pictures from this area. Now, this is one that was discovered fairly recently, and I was really surprised to see it. It's obviously done like the Chambers picture, but it's only preserved, to my knowledge, in a photograph of it that's part of the Thurston County Historical Commission website. And it's the Kegie Farm from the 1890s. And one thing that I think is interesting, when you look at the farmhouse, some people think a farm is just one building, but here this clearly shows all these outbuildings all around it. Now, this is an interesting Lacey area drawing, and it's actually a photograph of a drawing done by Edward Lange. And this is, it's called the Heinz Fleetwood Farm. I believe by the time Edward Lange drew this, it really was owned by the Fleetwood family. But it shows a farm that is now the site of the Lacey Senior Center and Lacey Community Center. This one I found really interesting, and I've checked with Father Peter at St. Martin's for information about this. They recognize this image as the earliest known drawing of St. Martin's, It shows not the brick building we have today. It shows the wooden building that came first. This is an 1895 advertisement. This drawing later became the design they put on the early diplomas of the St. Martin's College. And if you look at it carefully, the advertisement, there's one thing I found really fascinating about this. It says Lacey Post Office, Woodland, Washington. And that kind of captures the whole thought that at first that the community of Lacey was known as Woodland, then the post office was called Lacey, but the rest of the community was Woodland. So here you have both Lacey Post Office and the community of Woodland. Eventually, it all becomes Lacey. Oh, I should mention too, there's newspaper articles that mention that Edward Lange worked for O.C. Lacey, that the town, the post office, then the city is named after. And he did different maps of South Sound for O.C. Lacey and his development plans. None of those paintings have survived. This is one that is one of my favorite ones in the Lacey area. And this is the Russell Farm on Chambers Lake. And it's an oil painting, about 1895. It shows the whole farm in action. It was also a sawmill on the lake too. That's part of the family's operations. Edward Lange, depending on how much people were willing to pay him, ranged from a pencil drawing to an oil painting. The oil painting, of course, was the most expensive one, and there's very few oil paintings that he did here. So this is a very rare item. And this is I think it's a great one too. This is the Wiggins Farm, and it's located what used to be the territory between Olympia and Lacey area, but now it's part of Olympia. Wiggins Road, and if you went back to this painting, you stood in the middle, you're looking down the road, you're looking towards the Yelm Highway, so you're looking south. And to me, this is a fascinating picture. If you notice on the right, the boy riding the bicycle riding was really popular here in the 1890s and early 1900s. And often in pictures, Lange has bicycles. One of the interesting things is that I actually found a Lange, or a couple of Langes, that he has automobiles in, but not too many. Okay, one of the most easiest ways to find a Lange image is through the letterhead. Many of his pictures were made into letterheads, illustrations, and you can see on this one, and these are quite rare. This is the only example I've ever found of this. And it's of the Lansdale Cranberry Marsh, which is right where the Woodard Creek comes in. It's now officially part of Olympia, but it's kind of the area between Olympia and Lacey. And for a period of time, Charles Lansdale had a cranberry operations that later was taken over by Dr. Nathaniel Redpath. And to me, it shows all these very interesting. And you can see in the front the Northern Pacific Railroad going by. Okay, this is a fascinating one. I was really surprised to see this. I just found this not that many years ago, just a couple of years ago. And this was at Washington State Archive. Often the letters, the letters themselves are very mundane, but the illustrations are fascinating. This shows a store in Tenino, about 1892 or so. And the T.J. McClellan store, which through a whole series of changes remained a store in Tenino for a number of years, 100 years. And I don't think it's still in operation though. And in it, the store owner wanted to show how much he had in the store and the variety in the store. And one of my favorite parts of this is there is a man. he's in the center, just a little bit to the right, and he's looking, another man's looking at him, and the first man is holding a shirt against him. I almost picture him saying to the other man, how does it look? Will it fit me? And there's obviously clothing here, all types of goods here being sold. And it's an interesting picture. A lot of the pictures that Lange did, there's no other photographs of it. There's no other documentation. And that's certainly the case with this image. Okay, this is kind of a fascinating picture. Lange did a lot of these pictures that showed the whole of the southern Puget Sound. And of course, he called them bird's eye views. And it's like from the viewpoint of a bird looking down on the land. And if you look on this one, this was in a publication, 1895. Down in the front, a little bit to the left, that's Tumwater. And then you see the Jutes River going into Bud Inlet, and it curves around to the left, and then goes north. And to the right of it, kind of in the center on the left side, that's Olympia. And you can see Cooper Point on the left, and you see the different islands and stuff. And of course, this had to be kind of from his imagination and from looking at maps. Now, the interesting connection to Lacey is, if you look to the right, just a little down, not in the corner, but down almost halfway, but just a little above, you see this kind of curve there. This curve, it looks like a road that's kind of goes up and then curves in. That's the Lacey racetrack, the Woodland racetrack. And it was important enough in the early 1890s for Lange to put this in the picture. This is a image that Karen Johnson at the Smith House discovered a few years ago and told me about. And it's definitely an Edward Lange image of the Capital Brewery Company, which in 1903 changed to be the Olympia Brewery Company. And you see the Tumwater Falls to the right, and you see, of course, the brewery operation in the center. Now here's a detail, and on the left you see the trademark for the company, and then on the right you see this little vessel launch, and it's called the Montana, and I believe it was owned by the Smith family. And it's called Montana because when Leopold Smith came west, he first settled in Montana, and then he had a brewery there. Then he came out to Olympia, and so he still had ties to Montana. That's why the boat's called Montana. Leopold Smith and Edward Lange were both from Hesse, both born in 1846, and they seem to have had good ties, working ties between them. There's many paintings that Lange was said to have done for the brewery company. Karen has found that information in the archives there. Unfortunately, we don't have many that still survive. The one that gets me the most, though, is I found a couple of years ago a newspaper article that talked about a painting of the Olympia Brewery Company and Tumwater Falls and stuff. And it was supposed to be like 4 feet by 7 feet. And it was on display in the Olympia Hotel. No one's ever seen it, and there's no photo of it, there's no image of it. Now, this one's interesting because it's from a Lange drawing from about 1905. It shows what we now call the old brew house. And then up above it, of course, is the Smith House. And to the left, it's hard to see, but in the upward, on the same level as the Smith House, but to the left on top of the hillside is another structure that's kind of brown looking. That's the the Swiss chalet that that Smith had built for the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland in 1905, and that he brought up to Olympia. And it seems like the thought was to have it up there, maybe as a clubhouse, but instead it went to Priest Point Park, where it remained kind of a community gathering point for many decades. Now, what I found interesting from this postcard at Bancroft is down below, it was obviously used by the Olympia Brewery Company, their branch in California. This one was just a very recent discovery. I would say about a year ago. The date is incorrect. 1861 is not true. What it was, it's a drawing by Lange of a photograph of Olympia, that of 4th Avenue, and I would say more in the 1870s, not 1861. You can see Columbia Hall on the right, which is built in 1869. Anyway, the picture's gone, but Lange did a drawing of it. And what's interesting is on the left, and I'm not quite sure what building it is. It might be the first or the second. I'm thinking maybe the first, was a restaurant, the Mars restaurant, that was owned by an African-American family and was quite a prominent restaurant in Olympia. And the Mars family is a prominent African-American pioneers in Olympia. It's the only picture of the building. Now, this was a discovery this summer. I was working at the Washington State Library, and I came across in a book that had a lot of, I guess what you call invoices or receipts, different ones. And this was one by John C. Percival, and it's for the Percivals Dock, or the City Dock, as it was known, about 1891. And that drawing above is, I think, one of the great master drawings of Olympia's maritime history. Gordon Newell, the old historian, the late historian, he passed away years ago, really liked this illustration. And you have all those steamboats lined up, one after another, famous steamboats in Olympia. But what made it special this summer was another discovery. I couldn't believe when I found this. This was in the same book, and it's Edward Lange's receipt for payment for doing that Percival City Docks drawing. He was paid on November 19th, 1890, received of J.C. Percival $15 for view of the dock, and then Edward Lange. And I'm sure glad that that big mark in the middle doesn't cover Edward Lange's signature. That would be not good. But yeah, this was a remarkable survival of Edward Lange's career. Now, for Olympia, this is considered probably the great masterpiece of Edward Lange's work. And it's one of those typical Lange pieces in which there's a panoramic or widespread view of the city in the middle, and then what they call vignettes, or small little pictures in the corners above and below. And it's just a remarkable one. It came out in 1903, and I think Lange himself was quite proud of this. The way he described it, saying Edward Lange, Artist, Olympia, USA, and a really long signature for him. And if you look at the vignettes, oftentimes the neatest things about Lange's work are in the small vignettes in which he captures daily life from that time period. On the left, you can see picking fruit and berries. On the right, you can see the logging industry, a sawmill and logs being brought into it. I always think too that Lange must have really liked nature, because the way he draws mountains, trees, and stuff, he put a lot of effort into them. This was a strange discovery. Happened, maybe about 3 years ago. I was contacted by this auction house in New York City, and they had several Lange drawings, watercolors, like this was one of them they were selling. And they wanted to know if there were people out here in Washington interested in purchasing it. So I contacted a lot of people, and I usually got who's Edward Lange? So no one from Washington purchased. It was very expensive too. And so luckily they were purchased by the Beneke Library, Yale University, who seems to have a very large acquisition fund. And they purchased this one. This is the one for Western Washington. And it's the Olympia Oyster Industry, Washington, with a nice maritime view. And the part I like is it's almost like a cutaway of the water. And you can see the people with the rigs going down. You see the fish in the water, the eels and the fish. And I thought quite imaginative we did on this one. So it is preserved back in Connecticut. This is one I discovered late last year. And I was looking at what they call the University of Washington virtual room. And it's an interesting way that you can do by Zoom, look at things in their collection. And I've done it a lot. I'm sure many scholars have done it too. And I was looking at my first box. And when they brought out, they had this brochure that was kind of misplaced in the box, but it was done for a Westport Land Company in 1893. And it had different Lange drawings in it, very interesting one. And this shows a type of Lange drawing that he did throughout his career. And this one is a map. It's a map of Western Washington. And if you think of yourself, down at the bottom, you're on the Cascade Mountains, and you're looking towards the ocean to the west. And you can see Puget Sound in the center, Vancouver Island, Canada to the right, Oregon to the left. And you see all these details of ships out there and everything. Lange did do a number of these, but I have never seen this one before. And this is another letterhead illustration I came across. And the name of the hotel, I actually looked up. It's a strange name. It's from back east. It's a Native American name from a tribe back there. And it's Massasoit Hotel in Tacoma, because Lange was not just active in Thurston County. He was active through the whole Northwest, into Oregon, into Idaho, and also up in British Columbia. What I found interesting about this one is that it reminded me a lot of his work back on the East Coast, but also the fact that it's so detailed. And the fact is that today, 100 years plus after this was done, the building on the right, that right half of the hotel, the wooden building, is gone. It's been replaced by a brick building. But the one on the left, that part of the hotel, the brick part, that still stands. And it's actually part of the University of Tacoma, University of Washington at Tacoma. And what's kind of cool about it is that it's being used today as part of the university. I think it's the Institute of Technology or something like that, funded by Gates and other, Microsoft people. And anyway, so part of the building still exists. And one thing I should mention about Lange drawings, he liked to show a world in motion. And so there's all this transportation. You have people walking, people riding bicycles sometimes, trolley cars, people riding a horse and buggy. And in fact, if you look closely at some of them, there's different types of horses and buggies. I suppose a historian could learn a lot about the buggies and horses being used at that time by looking at these pictures. Each picture is like a drawing of a way of life that is long gone. Back on Long Island, they recently had done some work studying that in a lot of his farm pictures, there's birdhouses, different birdhouses. And at that time in the 1870s and 1880s, birdhouses were built by the farmers to encourage birds to live there and to eat insect pests. This is an interesting one. When the book came out in 2012, I couldn't find much on Wenatchee, But since then, I have found a lot of things about Wenatchee. So I wrote an article that appeared this summer in the Wenatchee Valley Museum Journal. And this is a picture, a bird's eye picture of Wenatchee from 1904, looking across the Columbia at the town. And one thing about Lange pictures is a lot has changed since his time to now. And in his time, you see in Eastern Washington, but also in Western Washington, the towns themselves seem almost very fragile against a very immense landscape. You also see his use of vignettes everywhere too. The vignette in the lower right corner is interesting because it shows a tramway. I remember showing a librarian at the state library about the tramway, and it was a way that a steamboat came to a place and they're loading wheat or unloading wheat, they could transport the wheat up and down stiff hills, steep hillsides up and down on these tramways. Now this is one that I thought was a remarkable discovery. I was calling the Spokane Public Library, the Northwest Room, and was asking about some question, and the librarian says, "Oh, Drew Crooks, I'm reading your book on Lange, and yes, we have an Edward Lange drawing, and this is it." Edward Lange, besides living in Olympia, oftentimes, on a seasonal basis, that would be probably summer and early fall, he would stay in Spokane and go from Spokane up into British Columbia, Idaho, and other places. And this is the lower falls of the Spokane River in Spokane, about 1895. Now, this is a picture of Edward Lange about 1905. At this time, he was at the height of his career. He remained very active till he was till close to his death. And the thing is, he would go and did a lot of work here in Olympia and Thurston County. But he also traveled throughout the state, the Pacific Northwest. And fortunately, a descendant of Edward Lange, Ripvac Lange, had shared with me postcards that he wrote to different relatives, to members of his family. And he would talk about what he did. And the thing about Edward, he was never a wealthy man. I would say he lived quite simply and humbly. And he was always a working man. He was always working. He was very careful with his money. When he lived in Olympia, up on the Upper East Side, pretty close to where I grew up in, he had a farm at his place, some fruit trees. He grew different crops a little bit. He was, in a way, a farmer still, but always an artist. He was always working on his art. If he went to some other place like Spokane or British Columbia, he would, during the wintertime, come back to Olympia and Thurston County, and we put it all together and complete his artwork. The thing about Edward Lange was that his health started deteriorating about 1910, 1911. He had what they call rheumatism of the hip, and it turned out to be a tumor. When it hit him back in the summer of 1912, he was he went to St. Peter Hospital, the wooden one that used to be up at where the Capitol campus is now, and he was there, and they couldn't save him. So he died on July 20th, 1912. He was an active member of the Masonic, of the Masons. So his funeral on July 22nd was held in the Masonic Temple, which is on Capitol Way and 8th Avenue. And then he was buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Tumwater, and he did not have a gravestone. Now, the thing is, why not a gravestone? He had a large gravestone for his wife, Sarah Denton Lange, who was buried in in the Catholic cemetery next to Union Cemetery in Tumwater. Lange was buried in the Masonic. He did not do a gravestone because I think he was a very frugal man. He wasn't a proud man, but he wanted the money saved for his children. And he tried to pass on whatever he had to his children. One of the saddest things is that he still had a number of paintings and watercolors and things at his house at what they call Summit Park, Upper East Side, Olympia. That house went to one daughter, Alice, and his son-in-law, her husband. And in the next year, in 2013, Alice was out working in the garden, and there was a what's that? Oh, and there was a fire in at the house, and the house burned. All the artwork was lost. The thing about Edward Lange is that his work has a timeless quality to it. This is a detail of the Wiggins Farm watercolor by Edward Lange. And it was, it shows a recording, a documentation of a way of life that's gone. And so each piece is like unique and precious. And I think it's important that these are recorded, preserved, and used to educate people. The project I'm doing is an ongoing project. It seems like the more you look, the more you find. I encourage people, if they know of any Edward Lange drawings, paintings, sketches, pictures, to contact Erin at the Lacey Museum, and then she can get hold of me. But if you do, please share them with us, because they need to be recorded at least. So anyway, I'm open to answer questions now if you wish.
Drew, thank you so much. Wow, that was awesome. I could just like feel your enthusiasm for this subject, which kind of like brings me to my first question. Although I will say, if anyone has a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A and I will get to it. I know that you talked about kind of when you first got into this, but what do you think it is about Edward Lange that has kind of like just stuck with you all this time and really made you want to just learn more?
His simple dedication, straightforward dedication to being an artist, and his ability to work with all types of people. You find examples in American art of people that did this type of work for a year, 2 years. He did this in Washington from 1889 to 1912. And he did it in such great detail and such sincerity. There's like a mixture of folk art, accuracy. It's just kind of a unique combination to it.
Has there been any of his like writing or anything found where he's written about his art or anything like that?
Okay, his art, I have 2 notebooks of newspaper articles that talk about his art. I mean, newspaper articles from his time period, and sometimes they talk about his art. He has written once or twice in it, but nothing personal, nothing about his artwork in a sense that tells us, his motivation and all that. In a way, he seems kind of a private person. No, unfortunately not.
Interesting. It makes me wonder if he, wrote letters to anyone who just randomly has,
there is a famous letter he wrote in 1893 to one of his best friends in Long Island from Olympia, explaining why he left Long Island. And he basically he could not make an economic goal in Long Island. There was too much competition from, the artists from New York City, So he came out here and he found lots of employment. And he was very pleased to come out here. And his enthusiasm for art really comes out, but he never says like, this is where I learned how to do art.
Mhm.
Nothing personal like that. No.
Interesting. So we have a question from the audience. Peter asks, any thoughts on Lange's involvement in land speculation out west, interest in mining possibilities or real estate opportunities?
Oh, okay. He was hired by different companies to do drawings. And this ranges from the famous Arcadia orchards over in Deer Park, north of Spokane, to the what's another one? Some of the mining in the Cascade Mountains, like around Blewett Pass and stuff. And he clearly had a relationship to the mining groups that they hired him to do art. He probably, sometimes I believe he was paid with land lots, lots of land. Like he owned, when he died, he owned a lot in Chelan. I'm sure it was part payment to him. Did he invest in that? I don't think he had much money to invest. If he did, it was very minimal. Some of these, yeah, but in a way, his work helped advertise the different businesses, the different mining plans. He was known as a artist that drew a lot of mines over in the eastern part of the state and up into British Columbia. In fact, up in British Columbia, the Kootenay Mountains, silver mines, gold mines, he did a lot of those. One of the strangest mines he did was a mercury mine down in near Cottage Grove in Oregon, Central Oregon. So his work helped advertise the groups. He did not personally invest too much in it. He didn't have the money.
Okay. So Peter asks another, can you talk some more about his involvement / friendship with the brewing company and how that helped him secure some reliable commissions at the time?
Okay. There was an article I wrote about Tumwater and Edward Lange that's in I highly recommend this journal, the Thurston County Historical Journal, which you can find electronic copies on the Lacey Museum site and also hard copies at the different local libraries. Anyway, he had a close relationship with the Tumwater Olympia Brewery Company, and he did a series of pictures for them over time. At one time, the company bought a number of copies of his painting of the same view. He must have painted a series of a couple, and there's even in the Smith archives, there's a cash check to Edward Lange for some of his artwork that Lange signed, and then it went back to the company, but it was cashed out. He had a close ties with them. I wish there was more we knew about it, but it is remarkable over years he worked with them.
So I know you put your feelers out to various museums and that, of course, because of your book, people have reached out to you, but I am wondering how you have made some of your really unexpected discoveries, like the receipt or in that book from him or to him.
One thing I find out in research is kind of persistence. Because sometimes when you first look at something, there's nothing. Just recently, last month, I went to the Washington State Historical Society Research Center, and I was looking through a collection of invoices or receipts from the 1890s. And there was one that looked interesting, and I just made had a copy made. And then later, I looked at it's a Lange. It's clearly Lange. And it's the kind of unusual name, was the Gross Brothers store up in, they sold all types of things up in Tacoma. But the thing about Lange is sometimes I can really connect with museums and they understand what I'm looking for. Sometimes it's very hard.
Yeah.
I remember one museum up in King County that I went to, and they had a bird's eye view of Black Diamond there. And I said, do you have anything else? Any other pictures? Oh no, the archivist tells me, we have nothing like this. So when I left the room, I stepped out and the whole wall was a blown up photograph of Franklin. The Lange name was foot high. And how could you miss that? But I think anyone I recommend in museums and stuff, to take a look at the artwork and illustrations through time, because sometimes it's just a lot of information in them.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another question. Are there any current direct living Lange family members in our area?
Yes, well, it depends how you define area. That lives in this area of Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater? I don't think so. But in the Pacific Northwest and in Puget Sound, yes, there are relatives. And one particularly helped me a lot on this project. The Lange family, the 5 sons and daughters, they had families, and so there are Lange. The one thing that gets me is one daughter, the youngest, lived to 1969, and I wish I could have interviewed her. I know I was in junior high then, but still, I wish I could have interviewed her, because she could have said a lot about Lange, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it looks like that about wraps it up. Drew, I can't thank you enough. That was so interesting. I learned a lot, and it makes me want to go dig through the museum collections and see what I can find.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor to do this.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll see you soon. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next time. Bye now.
Bye.